I'm coming down now, from spooky Canada. Well now, there was an abandoned house sitting in the middle of a fancy neighborhood in Calgary that nobody would go near on a dare. And I mean nobody. Not even those crazy school kids. They were too frightened of the ghosts that haunted the place to set foot in the yard, and folks refused to walk down the road at night for fear of what they might see and hear. The neighbors were always complaining to the authorities about the moaning and screaming and maniacal laughter that came from the house every night. A few cautious visits to the place were made by the police, but each ended the same way, with the officer getting chased out of the house by the haunt and pelted with old boots all the way down the street. Finally, the local authorities refused to send anyone back to the house again, and the neighbors were told to either live with a ghost or move. Now, my pal Albert was the agent in charge of selling that haunted house, and he tried everything in his power to close a deal. He'd had a priest in to bless the place. In 2 minutes flat, the priest jumped out a window and went running for his life. He'd had a couple of mediums in to converse with the spirits. Last I heard, both those ladies were doing quite nicely in the local insane asylum, as long as folks were careful not to mention ghosts in their hearing. He'd even contacted a hoodoo doctor from down in the States to do some spells on the house, but the fellow turned tail as soon as he set foot on the road in front of the house, leaving behind a scattering of hoodoo dolls stuck with needles, gopher dust, and strange-looking potions in glass bottles. Finally, Albert lit on the notion of selling the house sight unseen to a rich city slicker from the States who wanted a place in the wilds of Canada. Worked like a charm, too. The fellow was eager to sign the papers, and Albert thought he'd finally got the place off his hands. Until the city slicker decided he'd wanted to visit the property after all. Albert was all set to take the fellow there at high noon when presumably the ghost was asleep, but the city slicker's train was delayed, so it wasn't until after dinner that the two men set off for the haunted house. It was a dark and rainy night, but early enough in the evening that the ghost might still be resting wherever it was that ghosts went to sleep. At least, Albert hoped this was the case. The house looked quiet and peaceful in the misty darkness as the two men stepped through the wrought iron gate and onto the overgrown pathway toward the sagging front porch. "Needs a little work," Albert said, "but that's why you're getting such a good bargain." "Just what I'd expect from the Wild West," the city slicker drawled happily. "You know, this place looks like it could be haunted." Albert started violently. "Nope, no ghosts here," he stuttered, crossing his fingers hopefully. He unlocked the front door, and it opened with an ominous creak that boded no good for those who dared enter. Albert swallowed nervously, but the city slicker just chuckled and said something about atmosphere. Albert relaxed a bit. This fellow was just too naive to be true, he thought, and wondered if he shouldn't have raised the price a little. The two men entered a tall foyer absolutely festooned with dusty cobwebs. "Creepy," the city slicker said enthusiastically. He bounded energetically into the center of the foyer, faced the sweeping staircase to the upper story, and raised his arms dramatically. "Come to me, foul spirits," he intoned loudly. Albert gasped in dismay. Was this fellow plumb loco? The city slicker whirled away from the grand staircase and was peering into the front parlor when the whole house rang with a sinister, unearthly chuckle. The laughter grew louder, taking on a maniacal edge that made Albert's hair stand on end. And then the voice spoke. "I'm coming down now," it boomed. The phantom overtones in the deep voice reached right down Albert's spine and tautened every nerve in his body. The city slicker jumped and then turned to Albert with a happy grin. "Great special effects! How'd you do that?" "I didn't," Albert said, his teeth chattering. He backed up until he hit the front door and stood there with his hand on the knob, staring up the great staircase in fear. "I'm coming down now," the voice boomed again, and the city slicker's grin slipped a bit. He looked at Albert's frightened posture and then followed the agent's gaze toward the stairs. A bright light exploded into being at the top of the steps and quickly resolved into a sinister green head with flaming eyes, writhing hair, and fangs instead of teeth. The head opened its mouth and screamed screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound that scraped across the nerves and set the legs running before the brain had a chance to kick in. As the head began rolling down the stairs toward the two men, Albert's nerve broke. He scrabbled at the door handle for a moment, realized he had to turn the knob to the right instead of the left, and a moment later was halfway down the road, his own scream rivaling that of the specter in the house behind him. It wasn't until he was almost home that he realized that he had company. The city